Cleo Hartwell, at 30 years old, believed her hands were for mending and scrubbing, not for the grace of a kitchen. Years of sharp words had taught her that a woman of her size, a woman built for work and not for show, had no business finding joy in food. So she cooked in secret, hiding the evidence of her small pleasures like a crime, jars of jewel-toned preserves tucked away in the darkest corners of the pantry. She did not know that the stern rancher she worked for, Walt Brennan, was a man starved for a taste of home he thought he'd lost forever, and she could not possibly imagine the words he would one day whisper, not about her cooking, but about her, words that would undo every cruel belief she had ever carried. Stay close and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The big house on the Brennan Ranch was a quiet place, made quieter still by the absence of its matriarch. Martha Brennan had been gone 4 months, and the silence she'd left behind seemed to have seeped into the very timbers of the house. It was Cleo's job to manage that silence. She polished furniture that held no memories for her, swept floors that no longer felt the tread of a family's daily life, and aired out rooms that echoed with a palpable loss. She had been hired a month after the funeral, a practical solution to a practical problem. Walt Brennan needed a housekeeper, and Cleo Hartwell needed a position where she could be useful, and most importantly, overlooked. She moved through the house with a quiet efficiency that bordered on invisibility. She was a solid woman, tall and broad-shouldered, and she had spent a lifetime learning how to take up less space than her body required. She kept her eyes down, her voice low, and her opinions to herself. Her aunt's words were a constant litany in the back of her mind, a sharp counterpoint to the gentle rhythm of her chores. A girl with your appetite will never find a husband. Men like a delicate woman, Cleo, not sturdy. So she had made herself sturdy in spirit as well as body. She had stopped wanting what she was told she could not have. She did not expect to be wanted. In truth, she had stopped wanting to be wanted. Her life was this: the scent of lye soap, the weight of clean linens in her arms, and the profound, aching loneliness of a house that was not her own. But there was one place, one time, when she allowed herself a small, secret joy. Late at night, when the ranch was asleep and Mr. Brennan was shut away in his office with his ledgers and his grief, she would slip into the kitchen. The pantry, with its dwindling stores from Martha's last harvest, was her sanctuary. There, by the low light of a single lantern, she would transform the last of the season's fruit into something beautiful. It was a foolishness, she knew, a waste of sugar and time. But the gentle bubble of a pot on the stove, the scent of cinnamon and clove, the quiet satisfaction of sealing a jar against the coming winter, these were the only things that felt truly hers. She would hide the results of her late-night work behind sacks of flour and tins of dried beans, small, dark jars of contraband sweetness, a testament to a hunger she was not supposed to feel. Walt Brennan was a man carved from the same hard Oregon landscape as his ranch. He was tall and lean, his face weathered by sun and worry, his eyes the color of a stormy sky. Since his mother's death, he had retreated into a fortress of silence, communicating with his ranch hands through curt nods and single-word commands. The ranch ran on his grim efficiency, a testament to his will, but the heart had gone out of the place, and out of him. He had noticed the change in the house since Miss Hartwell's arrival. It was cleaner, more orderly, but that wasn't what held his attention. He noticed things she thought went unseen. He saw how she cared for his mother's remaining rose bushes, her large, capable hands surprisingly gentle as she pruned the dead canes. He noticed the faint, pleasing scent of spices, cinnamon, sometimes clove, that clung to the air in the kitchen some mornings, a scent that had no business being there when the meals she served him were plain, serviceable things. He saw the way she flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of her shoulders whenever he entered a room unexpectedly, as if she were bracing for a blow or a rebuke. He was not a cruel man, merely a man locked away with his own sorrow, and her quiet, almost fearful presence was a mystery to him. He found himself watching her, this solitary woman who ran his house with a competence that reminded him of his mother, but with a hesitant, shadowed energy that was all her own. One morning, he came into the kitchen earlier than usual. The sun was just beginning to spill over the mountains, painting the room in pale, watery light. She was there, her back to the door, wiping down the long oak table. She didn't hear him enter. For a long moment, he just stood in the doorway, watching the steady, circular motion of her arm. She was humming, a low, tuneless sound that was so unexpected, so deeply personal, that he felt like an intruder. The sound stopped the instant she sensed him. Her entire body went still, her shoulders hiking up toward her ears. She turned slowly, her face scrubbed clean of whatever small pleasure she'd been feeling. "Mr. Brennan," she said, her voice quiet and formal. "I didn't hear you." He walked to the stove, the sound of his boots loud in the sudden silence. "Coffee's hot, Mr. Brennan," she offered, already moving to fetch the pot. "Thank you, Miss Hartwell." He took the cup from her, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. He felt a jolt, a surprising warmth, and saw a faint flush rise on her cheeks. She turned away immediately, busying herself at the sink. He didn't leave. He stood by the stove, sipping the hot black coffee, and watched her. She was acutely aware of his presence, the size of him filling the space, his gaze a physical weight on her back. She was certain he was judging her, finding some fault in the way she'd cleaned the stove or stacked the dishes. She scrubbed a clean plate with unnecessary vigor, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. But Walt wasn't judging. He was simply seeing her. And he was beginning to wonder what else about this quiet, self-effacing woman he had failed to notice. The tilt happened on a Tuesday afternoon, in the close confines of the walk-in pantry. A late autumn chill had settled over the valley, and Walt was searching for a box of old ledgers his mother had stored away. He pushed open the pantry door to find Cleo already there, standing on a small step stool, her arms raised as she organized tins on a high shelf. The space was narrow, smelling of dried herbs, flour, and the faint, sweet scent of fruit. She startled when she saw him, nearly losing her balance. He reached out instinctively, his hand closing on her arm to steady her. "Easy there, Miss Hartwell." His touch was firm, impersonal, but it sent a shock through her. She froze, her arm captured in his grip, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Thank you, Mr. Brennan," she murmured, stepping down from the stool and pulling her arm free as if his touch had burned her. He let her go, but he didn't move away. The small space forced a proximity that was new and unsettling. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He turned his attention to the shelves, his gaze scanning the neatly arranged rows. "My mother kept the old account books in here somewhere," he said, his voice a low rumble in the enclosed space. As he reached for a high shelf above her head, his arm brushed against her shoulder. Again, she went utterly still. He seemed not to notice, his focus on a dusty wooden box, but as he pulled it down, his gaze caught on something tucked behind a large sack of flour. It was a small, unlabeled jar filled with a dark, glistening preserve. Her secret stash of spiced plum jam. He picked it up, turning the small glass jar over in his large, calloused hands. "What's this?" he asked, his voice neutral. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. "Oh, that's nothing, Mr. Brennan," she said, the lie quick and clumsy on her tongue. Just some old things of your mother's I was meaning to clear out." He looked from the jar to her face, his gray eyes steady and unreadable. He saw the flush on her cheeks, the way her gaze darted to the floor, refusing to meet his. A slow, deliberate moment passed. "My mother didn't make plum jam," he said. It was not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact that dismantled her lie completely. The air grew thick and heavy. He knew. He had found her out. She waited for the rebuke, for the dismissal she was sure would follow. But it didn't come. He just stood there, the jar still in his hand, looking down at her. The silence stretched, filled with everything she was afraid of and something else she couldn't name. Finally, with a careful, almost gentle motion, he placed the jar back on the shelf, tucking it behind the flour sack exactly where he had found it. He had seen her secret, and he had not mocked it. He had simply put it back in its hiding place. Then he nodded once, a curt, unreadable gesture, and left the pantry, leaving her alone with the frantic beating of her own heart. That night, sleep would not come. Cleo lay stiffly in her narrow bed in the small room off the kitchen, the memory of the encounter in the pantry replaying itself in her mind. His closeness, the heat of his body, the weight of his gaze as he held the jar of jam, her secret, in his hand. She pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes, trying to force the image away. It was nothing, she told herself. It was a man looking for a box who happened upon a jar of preserves. She was reading meaning into a shared space, a simple question. She was a fool. She began to list the reasons, a familiar and painful catechism of self-doubt. He was Walt Brennan, owner of one of the largest ranches in the valley, a man of standing and property. He was still in mourning for his mother, his heart closed and guarded. And she was Cleo Hartwell, the housekeeper, a woman who had been told her entire life, in ways both subtle and brutally direct, that her body was a failing. She remembered her own mother, a frail, bird-like woman, sighing as she let out the seams on another of Cleo's dresses. She remembered her aunt's sharp pronouncements at the dinner table, her fork pointing accusingly. "A girl with your appetite will never find a husband, Cleo. You must learn restraint." She had learned it. She had learned to restrain her appetite, her hopes, her very presence in the world. Men's eyes slid past her as if she were part of the furniture, or worse, they lingered for a moment with a kind of pitying dismissal. She was 30 years old, a spinster, a woman whose future was a long, straight line of service and solitude. The idea that a man like Walt Brennan, a man of his station, a man consumed by his own quiet sorrows, would see her, truly see her, was a dangerous fantasy. It was the kind of foolish hope that could break a woman's heart. She had built her defenses carefully over the years, a wall of practicality and low expectations. She could not afford to let a single crack appear. He had looked at her, yes, but it was curiosity, nothing more. He was probably annoyed that she was using his sugar, his plums, his mother's canning jars for her own clandestine projects. He was probably just deciding how to reprimand her. She resolved then, in the cold darkness of her room, to be more careful. She would scrub the memory of his gaze from her mind. She would be smaller, quieter, more invisible than ever. She would bury her little joys so deep he would never find them again. A few nights later, a storm blew in from the mountains. A wild, keening wind that rattled the window panes and moaned in the chimney. The ranch hands were hunkered down in the bunkhouse, the main house dark and silent against the onslaught. Cleo couldn't sleep. The storm seemed to have stirred up all her own inner turmoil. She sat in the kitchen, the fire in the big hearth casting flickering shadows on the walls, nursing a cup of chamomile tea she didn't really want. The house groaned around her, and in a lull in the wind, she heard it. The soft tread of footsteps in the hall. Her breath caught. It was Walt. He should have been asleep hours ago. He appeared in the doorway, a tall silhouette against the darkness of the hall. He wasn't dressed for bed, still in his work shirt and trousers. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. He didn't seem surprised to find her there. He walked past her to the hearth, staring into the flames for a long moment as if gathering his thoughts. The wind howled, and the fire popped and hissed. "I couldn't sleep," he said finally, his voice different in the deep quiet of the night, lower and rougher than she was used to, stripped of its daytime authority. She said nothing, just watched him, her hands wrapped tightly around her warm mug. He turned from the fire and walked slowly to the table where she sat. He didn't take the chair opposite her, the one that would have kept a safe distance between them. He pulled out the chair right beside her and sat down. The sudden proximity was unnerving, electric. He smelled of the cold night air, of pine, and of man. He didn't speak for a long time, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from her cup. The silence was not empty, it was charged, heavy with unspoken things. Finally, he looked at her. "That jam in the pantry," he said, his voice barely above a murmur. "You made it." It was not a question. It was a statement that left no room for denial. She swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. I shouldn't have," she stammered, the words tumbling out in a rush of apology. "I used the last of the plums. I'm sorry. It was presumptuous of me. I won't do it again." He didn't seem to hear her apology. His focus was somewhere else, somewhere deep inside himself. "My mother," he began, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "She used to make spiced plum jam, with extra clove." He looked down at his own hands, resting large and still on the oak table. "I haven't had it since I was a boy." When he lifted his head, his eyes were raw with a grief so profound it stole the air from her lungs. The stern, unapproachable rancher was gone, and in his place was a man adrift in his sorrow, reaching for a memory. He stood then, his movement slow and deliberate in the firelight. Without a word, he walked to the pantry and returned a moment later with the small, dark jar of jam and a silver spoon. He set them on the table between them, a silent offering. The gesture was so much louder than words. "I want to taste it," he said, his voice low and steady. A wave of pure terror washed over her. This was it. The moment of judgment. This small, secret part of herself, the only part that felt joyful and true, was about to be tasted and surely found wanting. "Please don't taste it," she begged, the words coming out in a choked whisper. "Please, Mr. Brennan. It's not right. It's not like hers would have been. You'll only be disappointed." It was a plea to protect him from disappointment, but it was truly a plea to protect herself from the confirmation of her own inadequacy. He looked at her, his gray eyes holding hers, and in them she saw not a command, but a deep and desperate need. He paid no mind to her plea. With steady hands, he twisted the lid off the jar. The scent of sweet plums, sharp cinnamon, and the deep, earthy note of clove bloomed in the air between them, a ghost of 1,000 other autumn kitchens. He dipped the spoon into the dark, glistening preserve and lifted it. He did not eat it right away. He held it for a moment, then brought it to his lips. He closed his eyes. The world seemed to stop. The wind outside died to a whisper. The fire in the hearth held its breath. Clea watched his face, her own heart a painful, silent drum against her ribs. She saw the hard, stern lines of his jaw soften. A muscle worked there just once. A long, shuddering breath escaped him. He didn't speak for what felt like an eternity. When he finally opened his eyes, they were shining with unshed tears. The grief he had held so tightly locked inside him had been cracked open by a spoonful of jam. He looked at her, and the distance between them, the chasm of employer and housekeeper, of a man of property and a woman of no account, simply vanished. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers, his touch warm and real. He stood, gently pulling her to her feet. He closed the last few inches of space between them until she was surrounded by his scent, his heat. He leaned in close, his breath a warm caress against her ear, and his voice was thick with emotion, a broken whisper that remade her world. "You taste like home," he said. The words were not about the jam, they were about her. He lifted his other hand to her face, his calloused thumb stroking the curve of her cheek with an impossible tenderness. "You're not too big for me, Cleo," he murmured against her hair. "You're just right." Every cruel word, every sharp judgment she had ever absorbed, dissolved in the warmth of that single, whispered claim. She couldn't speak. She couldn't move. She could only lean into his touch, a silent, shuddering surrender to a kindness she had never imagined. He kept his hand on her cheek as he led her from the kitchen, his other hand warm and firm at the small of her back, a silent, guiding pressure. The house was a vessel of shadows and silence around them. The only sound the creak of the floorboards under his heavy boots and the distant, fading sigh of the storm. He carried the single candle he'd lit in the kitchen, and its small, brave flame cast their intertwined shadows long and dancing on the walls of the hallway. It felt like a dream, a strange and wonderful passage from one life into another. His room was at the back of the house, large and masculine, dominated by a heavy oak bedstead and the scent of leather and wood smoke. He didn't release her. He guided her toward the hearth, where embers still glowed from an earlier fire. He added a log, and soon small flames licked at the dry wood, pushing back the shadows. He finally let go of her to shrug off his heavy wool coat, which he folded with a surprising neatness and laid over the back of a worn leather chair. He turned back to her, his face illuminated by the growing firelight, his expression one of quiet, solemn intensity. He drew the heavy curtains over the windows, shutting out the last of the storm and enclosing them in their own private world. The room was filled with the sound of the wind, the crackle of the fire, and the frantic beat of her own heart. She felt a lifetime of shyness, of feeling wrong in her own skin, rise up in her. "Walt," she breathed, the use of his given name a shocking intimacy on her tongue. He came to her then and placed a finger gently against her lips. "Shh," he murmured. There was no need for words. His hands came up to cup her face, his gaze searching hers with a raw reverence that made her tremble. No one had ever looked at her this way, as if she were something to be treasured, something precious. He held her as if she were the most natural and necessary thing in the world. The weight of his hands, the solidness of his body so close to hers, was an anchor in the dizzying sea of her astonishment. The heavy oak bed creaked once under their combined weight, a single resonant sound in the quiet room. And then there was only the sound of the fire and the wind, and the shared, quiet rhythm of their breathing in the warm, flickering dark. Later, much later, she lay awake as the room turned from black to a soft, pearly gray. The storm had passed. His arm was a heavy, comforting weight around her waist, his body a warm, solid presence behind her. She lay perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to break the spell. She watched the dawn light filter through the curtains, tracing the unfamiliar patterns on the ceiling, listening to the slow, deep sound of his breathing. She turned her head slightly on the pillow. He was awake too, watching her. In the pale morning light, his eyes were clear. The storm of grief passed, replaced by a quiet, steady possession that was more breathtaking than any passion. He said nothing. He just tightened his hold, his arm a definitive band around her, pulling her back against the solid wall of his chest. It was not just an embrace. It was a statement. A claim. She woke to find the space beside her empty. The indentation of his head was still on the pillow. The sheets still held a trace of his warmth, but he was gone. A cold, familiar dread seeped into her bones, chilling her more than the morning air. It had been a mistake, a moment of shared grief and profound loneliness that the harsh light of day would burn away to ash. She had been a comfort to him, a convenience, and now she would be an embarrassment, an object of pity or worse, regret. She scrambled from the bed, her hands trembling as she pulled on her plain work dress. She had to get back to her own room, back to her own life before anyone knew. She would slip back into her role as the quiet, invisible housekeeper. She would be Miss Hartwell again. She would go about her duties, her face a neutral mask, and they would never, ever speak of what had happened. She would not embarrass herself or him by expecting anything more. She smoothed her hair with shaking fingers, took a deep, steadying breath, and opened the bedroom door. The kitchen was just down the hall. She would start the coffee just as she did every morning. She would pretend. She stepped into the kitchen, her heart a cold stone in her chest, and stopped dead. He was there. He was not dressed for the ranch. He was sitting at the oak table in a clean shirt, his hair still damp. The stove was already lit, a pot of coffee sending a fragrant steam into the air. 2 cups were set out on the table. 2. He looked up as she entered, and his expression was calm, gentle, unwavering. There was no regret in his eyes, no awkwardness. He simply watched her as she stood frozen in the doorway. He rose from his chair, his movements unhurried, and walked to the stove. He poured a cup of coffee and brought it to her, placing the warm ceramic mug into her cold, trembling hands. His fingers deliberately brushed against hers, a slow, lingering touch that sent a jolt of warmth straight up her arm. "Good morning, Cleo," he said. His voice was low and private, meant only for her, yet it held the easy confidence of a man speaking in his own home to a woman who belonged there. She murmured a reply, her voice barely a whisper, and moved past him toward the sideboard where the cream and sugar were kept. As she passed, he reached out and placed his hand on the back of her neck. It was a gesture of casual, confident ownership, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin there, sending shivers down her spine. The simple, possessive touch shattered the last of her morning doubts. This was not a man who was pretending nothing had happened. This was a man who was making it clear that everything had changed. He was not letting her go. He was not letting her retreat into the shadows. He was staying. The change in the house was as quiet and profound as the turning of a season. The silence was still there, but it was no longer the silence of grief. It was the quiet of contentment. The rhythm of their days found a new, shared cadence. They spoke little, but a language grew between them, made of small gestures and shared glances. A cup of coffee left on the porch rail for him in the morning. A wildflower he'd picked tucked into the handle of her mending basket. Elias, the oldest of the ranch hands, a man who had worked for Walt's father, was the first to notice. He saw Walt come up behind Cleo as she served dinner in the main house, his hand resting for a brief, proprietary moment on her back before he took his seat. Elias caught her eye and gave a slow, knowing wink, his leathery face crinkling into a smile of pure approval. He had seen his boss drowning in sorrow, and now he saw him breathing again. The real friction, when it came, was as predictable as it was unwelcome. It arrived in the form of Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, a woman whose piety was matched only by her sharp-eyed curiosity. She arrived one afternoon with a basket of what she called a proper housekeeper's scones, her tone implying that whatever Cleo was baking was certainly not. She found them on the front porch. Walt was in his usual chair, cleaning a piece of tack, and Cleo was in the rocker beside him, shelling peas into a large bowl in her lap. Walt's arm was not touching her, but it was resting along the back of her chair, a silent fence around her. Mrs. Gable's eyes, small and bright as a bird's, flickered between the two of them, taking in the comfortable domesticity of the scene. Her thin mouth tightened. "Mr. Brennan," she began, her voice as sweet and cloying as cheap perfume. "It is so good to see you looking recovered. But one must be so careful about appearances, especially after a loss. A man in your position. People do talk." The implied criticism hung in the air, aimed squarely at Cleo. Cleo froze, her hands stilling over the bowl of peas, the familiar shame washing over her. But Walt did not move. He didn't even look at Mrs. Gable at first. He finished wiping down the leather strap in his hands, his movements slow and deliberate. Then he turned his head and looked at Cleo, and his expression was so full of soft affection that it made her breath catch. Only then did he turn his cool, gray gaze to the preacher's wife. His voice when he spoke was level, calm, and utterly dismissive. "Let them," he said. And then, in a gesture that was both a comfort and a public declaration, he reached over and took Cleo's hand, lacing his fingers through hers, holding it firmly in his own right there on the porch where God and Mrs. Gable could see. "Cleo and I have no secrets," he said, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. He had claimed her, openly and without apology. He had stood between her and the judgment of the world. Mrs. Gable, flustered and defeated by his implacable calm, stammered a few pleasantries and made a hasty retreat, her scones forgotten on the porch steps. The friction had dissolved against the simple, solid fact of his choice. Autumn deepened, painting the cottonwoods along the creek a brilliant gold. The air grew crisp and sharp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Weeks had turned into months, and the life they were building was no longer new and fragile, but settled and strong, its roots growing deep into the soil of the ranch. They had gone to the circuit judge one Tuesday, quietly, with Elias and his wife as witnesses. There was no fanfare, no white dress, just a simple exchange of vows that confirmed what their hearts already knew. The house, once a place of echoing grief for Walt and dutiful service for Cleo, was now simply home. It was filled with the scents of their life together. Cinnamon and apple from the pies Cleo now baked without shame. The rich aroma of Walt's coffee brewing on the stove at dawn. The smell of saddle leather from his coat thrown over a chair. Cleo moved through the rooms with a new, easy confidence. Her shoulders were relaxed, her steps sure. The constant gnawing fear of being judged, of being too much, had finally receded, replaced by the profound and steadying knowledge of being wanted. She was at the great cast-iron stove, stirring a large pot of apple butter, its spicy sweet scent filling the warm kitchen. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She was lost in the gentle, rhythmic motion of the spoon, the peace of the moment. She didn't hear him come in. He moved with a quietness that was no longer startling to her, but familiar. He came up behind her, stamping the dust of the corral from his boots. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against the solid warmth of his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his arms a secure circle around her, and inhaled deeply. She could feel the rumble in his chest as he sighed, a sound of pure contentment. He was home. She leaned back into him, the wooden spoon still in her hand, the bubbling pot forgotten for a moment. All the shame she had carried for so long, the belief in her own unworthiness, had been burned away by this man's quiet, unwavering love. Here, in his arms, in their kitchen, she was not too big, not too much. She was simply Cleo, his Cleo. The narrator in her own mind, the one that had whispered such cruelties for so long, had finally fallen silent. She had been seen and wanted for exactly who she was, at the age she was, in the body she had. The secret, hidden parts of her had become the very things he cherished most. His voice was a low murmur against her hair, a warm vibration that echoed the words that had changed everything, but now spoken with the easy, sunlit intimacy of their shared life. "Still tastes like home, Cleo," he said. And she smiled, because she knew he wasn't talking about the apple butter.